The morning of 9th of November 1943 was cold at RAF Stradishall in Suffolk. A short Sterling bomber, serial number BK-716, sat on the dispersal pan before dawn. Ground crew had been working the aircraft since 0400 hours. The Coffman starter cartridge, a brass-cased explosive charge roughly the diameter of a man's thumb, was seated in the breech of the port-outer Bristol Hercules engine. The corporal in charge of the starting sequence pulled the firing lanyard. The cartridge did not fire cleanly. It detonated asymmetrically. The starter mechanism fractured under the imbalanced pressure surge. Roughly 1,200 pounds per square inch released in under a third of a second. A fragment of the steel starter body, approximately 3 inches long, punched through the lower engine cowling and struck the leading edge of the wing. BK-716 was grounded for 11 days. The incident was recorded in the station's Form 700 maintenance log as a mechanical failure during engine starting procedure. No further investigation was ordered. No Air Ministry accident report was raised. The cartridge batch, Lot 44C1102, drawn from RAF Stradishall's own equipment stores, remained in service. 12 aircraft at 4 Bomber Command stations were using cartridges from the same production lot that week. 3 years earlier, the Air Ministry's Directorate of Equipment had certified the Coffman starter as the standard engine starting solution for all multi-engine heavy aircraft in RAF service. The technical review that produced that certification ran to 14 pages. The section on misfire risk occupied 6 lines. But the real story of the Coffman cartridge starter is not the fragment that hit BK-716, nor the 11 days an aircraft sat unserviceable while Bomber Command needed every aircraft it possessed. It is the story of how British military aviation came to depend absolutely on a controlled explosion fired 2 feet from a ground crewman's face, and how the institution that specified that device chose, repeatedly and deliberately, to treat the hazard as a cost of doing business rather than an engineering problem to be solved. To understand why the Coffman starter existed, one must first understand the engine starting problem it was designed to solve, and why, by the late 1920s, that problem had become operationally critical. The piston aero engines of the Great War era were relatively small. A rotary clergy or a V8 RAF 4A could be swung by hand. A ground crewman gripping the propeller blade, pulling through compression and stepping clear as the engine caught. Dangerous, certainly. One mistimed backfire, one finger caught in a spinning blade, and the injury was permanent. But the procedure was understood, and the engine masses involved were manageable. By the mid-1920s, that era was ending. The Air Ministry's expansion program, formalized in the early 1930s through schemes that would eventually culminate in the expansion schemes of 1934 to 1939, demanded aircraft of increasing size and power. The Bristol Pegasus, the Armstrong Siddeley Tiger, and above all, the Bristol Hercules, a 14-cylinder, 2-row sleeve valve radial engine that displaced 2,160 cubic inches and produced between 1,075 and 1,800 horsepower, depending on mark, could not be swung by hand. They could not be started by a simple battery-powered electric motor either. At the temperatures regularly encountered on forward airstrips in Scotland, Iceland, the Western Desert, or the North Sea coast, electrical starters lacked the torque to overcome cold oil compression in a large radial engine. The oil thickened, the batteries discharged faster in the cold. Aircraft sat on the ground when they should have been airborne. The operational consequence was not theoretical. In the winter of 1938-1939, Bomber Command's Handley Page Hayford and Vickers Wellington squadrons were already logging unacceptable rates of starting failures in cold weather exercises. The failure rate on electrical starters in sub-zero conditions at RAF Marham and RAF Mildenhall that January ran to approximately 23% of all attempted starts, a figure drawn from station records subsequently cited in an Air Ministry Directorate of Technical Development internal note, dated February 1939, reference DTDE 112739. The Air Ministry needed a starting system that was compact, independent of battery charge, immune to cold weather degradation, and capable of delivering instantaneous, high-torque rotational impulse to an engine crankshaft. The specification that emerged, not formally designated under a single Air Staff requirement number, but circulated as a technical development requirement in late 1929, called for a device capable of rotating a 1-400 horsepower engine from rest to a minimum of 80 RPM in under half a second, at ambient temperatures down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The company that answered that specification was the Coffman Starter Company, operating from premises at Sunbury-on-Thames and founded in 1924 by Howard Marmon Coffman, an American engineer who had previously worked on propellant-actuated devices for the automotive industry. Coffman's insight was straightforward. If an aero engine needed a sudden, powerful rotational impulse that electrical systems could not reliably deliver, the solution was to use a controlled explosive charge, a purpose-designed cartridge, seated in a breech mounted on the engine, whose detonation drove a piston that engaged the engine's starter dog, a toothed coupling on the crankshaft, and rotated it through the compression stroke before the charge was exhausted. The principle was borrowed in part from artillery. Coffman's innovation was miniaturizing it, making the cartridge reloadable in the field within 30 seconds, and engineering the engagement and release mechanism so that the starter dog disengaged automatically once the engine reached self-sustaining speed, preventing the explosive-actuated piston from being dragged through a complete engine rotation. 3 competing designs were submitted to the Air Ministry's technical review in 1930. Bristol Aeroplane Company offered a compressed air system. Rotax proposed an enhanced electrical unit. Coffman's breech-type cartridge starter was selected as the primary solution following bench trials at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough, in the spring of 1931. The initial development contract, awarded in November 1931, was valued at £18,400, roughly £1.4 million at current prices. Production orders would follow in 1933 and escalate sharply through the expansion schemes. The first operational installation went into Bristol Pegasus-powered Vickers Wellingtons in 1937. By 1939, the Coffman starter was being fitted as standard to the Bristol Hercules, the Bristol Pegasus, the Bristol Centaurus, and the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp, the last by license arrangement for Fleet Air Arm aircraft using American engines. It was, in every practical sense, the mechanism by which the RAF's heavy aircraft got airborne. No Coffman, no start, no sortie. The engineering requirement had been met. The hazard assessment had not kept pace. The Coffman starter, at its simplest, was this: a steel breech housing mounted on the engine accessory casing, containing a cylindrical firing chamber approximately 2 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. A brass cartridge, visually similar to a large shotgun shell loaded with a fast-burning propellant charge, was seated in the chamber and locked by a quarter-turn bayonet fitting. A firing pin, actuated either by a pull lanyard from outside the cowling or, in later marks, by an electrical solenoid triggered from the cockpit, struck the cartridge primer. The primer ignited the propellant. The propellant burned completely in approximately 0.228 seconds, generating a pressure pulse of between 900 and 1,400 pounds per square inch, the precise figure varying with cartridge mark, ambient temperature, and engine compression ratio. That pressure pulse drove a rack and pinion mechanism, a toothed rod moving linearly against a toothed wheel, which rotated the engine crankshaft through between 1 and 2 complete revolutions. If the engine's throttle and mixture settings were correctly established by the cockpit crew, and if the engine was primed with sufficient fuel vapor, combustion in at least one cylinder would occur during that rotation. The engine would catch. The starter dog, the coupling between the starter mechanism and the crankshaft, was designed to disengage automatically at approximately 200 RPM, the speed at which the engine became self-sustaining. In practice, the disengagement was not always clean. This was the first known failure mode, documented in Farnborough bench tests as early as 1934. If the engine fired hard on the first compression stroke, a condition known as a kickstart, caused by a slightly over-rich mixture, the momentum could briefly reverse the crankshaft rotation before it stabilized. In that reversal, the starter dog, designed to disengage on forward rotation, could momentarily re-engage. driving the starter mechanism in reverse and fracturing the rack. The result? A jammed starter, an inoperative engine, and, in the worst cases, fragments of the steel rack ejected through the starter housing. The R.A. Farnborough test report documenting this failure mode, reference E&DTD 1934-147, recommended a modified dog clutch geometry. The modification was incorporated into production from the Mark IV starter onward in 1936. It reduced the re-engagement risk substantially. It did not eliminate it. The second failure mode was the misfire. If the cartridge propellant had absorbed moisture, a common occurrence in tropical climates, aboard ship, or in poorly sealed equipment stores, the burn was incomplete. The pressure pulse was insufficient to complete a full crankshaft rotation. The engine did not start. The cartridge had partially detonated but had not fully expelled its propellant. What remained in the breech was a partly burned charge, potentially still hot, in a sealed chamber. A ground crewman opening the breech too soon, and too soon could mean 60 seconds in cold weather, where the propellant residue cooled slowly, risked a secondary ignition of the residue against atmospheric oxygen. The Air Ministry's handling instructions, circulated from 1939 onward in Air Publication 2095, specified a waiting period of 3 minutes before opening the breech after a misfire. Ground crew under operational pressure, a formation departure time, an aircraft already late on its slot, did not always observe 3 minutes. The AP 2095 instructions acknowledged the risk. They relied on compliance rather than engineering to manage it. The Coffman performed, in its primary function, with a reliability that was genuinely remarkable. At the tested ambient temperature range of -30 to +50 degrees Fahrenheit, on a correctly maintained engine with a correctly stored cartridge of the right mark, the start success rate was approximately 94% on the first cartridge and 99% within 2 cartridges. For Bomber Command, operating from English airfields in winter with engines that might have sat for 8 hours overnight, that reliability was operationally decisive. No electrical starter of the period came close. The Rotax units then available delivered reliable starts down to approximately -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, battery discharge rates made them unpredictable. The compressed air systems required a ground rig, a compressor vehicle that had to be positioned alongside each aircraft before start. On a dispersed wartime airfield, with aircraft scattered across farm fields and perimeter tracks, the ground rig could not be everywhere at once. The Coffman needed nothing external. 1 cartridge, 1 man, 30 seconds to reload. It was self-contained, reliable, and lethal only when mishandled or when the cartridge was faulty. The Air Ministry understood all 3 of these facts. It chose to treat the third as acceptable. Early operational deployments confirmed the system's value. No. 7 Squadron at RAF Oakington, flying short Stirlings from late 1940, reported starting failure rates of under 4% across the winter of 1940-1941, compared with a command-wide average of 31% for electrically started aircraft during the same period. No. 35 Squadron at RAF Linton-on-Ouse, operating Handley Page Halifaxes from March 1941, logged not a single engine start abort due to starter failure in its first 6 months of operations. No. 1 point. 9 Squadron at RAF Mildenhall on Stirlings, No. 214 Squadron at Stradishall, and No. 218 Squadron at Marham all reported similar results. The decision was confirmed. The Coffman was the RAF's engine starting solution. The program had its mechanism, and it had proved itself in the field. The Air Ministry pressed on. By the summer of 1942, Coffman starters were installed on approximately 4,800 aircraft in RAF frontline service. By the end of 1943, that figure had risen to an estimated 8,400 aircraft across all commands: Bomber Command, Coastal Command, Fighter Command's night fighter units operating Bristol Beaufighters, and the Fleet Air Arms, Torpedo and Reconnaissance Squadrons. Production of the cartridges themselves, manufactured primarily by Ely Brothers at their Whitton, Birmingham plant, had reached 3.2 million units annually, By mid-1943, a further 800,000 units per year were being produced under subcontract at ICI's Nobel Division facility at Ardea in Ayrshire. The Coffman was not merely a component. It was the critical path of every heavy aircraft start sequence in the RAF's order of battle. On a typical bomber command night in the autumn of 1943, 700 to 800 heavy bombers might be prepared for operations across 30 to 40 stations in NOSPA 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 groups. Each aircraft had between 2 and 4 engines requiring Coffman starting. On a 4-engine Lancaster or Stirling, the procedure was to start engines in sequence, typically port inner first, then starboard inner, then the outers, using 1 cartridge per engine, with a reserve cartridge loaded for each engine in case of a first cartridge failure. That meant 2,800 to 3,200 cartridges detonated on a single operational night across England's eastern counties. In the hours between last light and midnight, the Lancaster, Avro's Type 683, the aircraft that came to anchor Bomber Command's offensive from 1942 onward, depended on the Coffman starter for all 4 of its Rolls-Royce Merlin tanks or Merlin 25 engines. The Merlin was not, in fact, a large engine by the standards of the Hercules or Centaurus. Its displacement of 1,150 cubic inches was substantially smaller. But in the cold of a Lincolnshire winter, at -15 degrees Fahrenheit with oil congealed in the sump and the battery at 60% charge after a night of running cockpit electrics, the electric starter alone was unreliable. The Coffman was fitted as the primary system, with electric starting as backup. Across the Fleet Air Arm, the situation was operationally acute in a different dimension. Carrier operations imposed starting time constraints that shore-based aviation never faced. A deck-spotted Fairy Swordfish or Grumman Avenger, positioned aft on a fleet carrier's flight deck at WWII-530 for a dawn anti-submarine sweep, needed its engine turning within 90 seconds of the order to start. Any longer, and the deck park cycle fell behind, delaying the strike's departure and, in the worst case, losing the sea state window for flying operations. The Coffman's half-second starting impulse made that 90-second sequence achievable. Electrical starting, with its cold weather variability, made it contingent. HMS Victorious, operating an Arctic convoy escort duty, HMS Formidable in the Indian Ocean, and HMS Illustrious in the Mediterranean. All were flying aircraft that depended on Coffman starters for operational reliability under conditions that would have reduced electrical start success rates to well below operational tolerances. In the Western Desert, the RAF's tactical air forces faced a different enemy: sand, heat, and the degradation of cartridge seals in extreme temperatures. No, 205 Group operating Wellingtons from Libya, No. 37 Squadron at Shalufa in Egypt, and No. 70 Squadron at Cabrit all reported that cartridges stored in unshaded equipment bays in summer reached internal temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, the propellant deteriorated, the pressure curve flattened, start failures increased. The solution, improvised at station level, was to store cartridges in the aircraft's shadow until immediately before use, a procedure not specified in AP 2095, adopted from experience and never formally acknowledged in Air Ministry technical instruction. In Burma, No. 356 Squadron operating Consolidated Liberators from Salbani, and No. 99 Squadron flying Wellingtons from Jasore, encountered the opposite problem: monsoon humidity. Cartridges stored in open-sided equipment sheds during the monsoon season absorbed sufficient atmospheric moisture to produce misfire rates as high as 15% on individual batches, compared with the 6% specification maximum. Squadron engineering officers raised the issue through the standard technical defect reporting channel, Form DAs-1, during the 1944 monsoon season. The responses from Air Ministry Directorate of Equipment, where they survive in AIR-2 series files at Q, were largely administrative. Advice to improve storage discipline, a reminder of the 3-minute misfire waiting procedure, and a note that replacement cartridges from improved sealed packaging were anticipated. The improved packaging, A hermetically sealed tin container replacing the cardboard tube previously used was eventually introduced for tropical supply chains in late 1944. It arrived too late to address the 1944 monsoon season's reported failures. Through all of this, the Coffman starter continued to function, continued to start engines, and continued to anchor the operational availability of aircraft that were carrying the war. The system was not broken, it was stressed, it was misapplied in conditions its designers had not fully anticipated, and it carried a residual hazard that was understood in outline at the Air Ministry level and managed inadequately through instructions rather than engineering. The first formal signal that the hazard was larger than the official record acknowledged came not from an Air Ministry investigation, but from a cluster of ground accident reports logged at RAF Mildenhall, RAF Oakington, and RAF Waddington between January and March 1944. 7 incidents of starter misfire resulting in secondary ignition of propellant residue were logged across those 3 stations in that 10-week period. 2 ground crew sustained burn injuries. In one case, at Waddington, involving a Lancaster of No. 9 Squadron, the secondary ignition set fire to the engine nacelle, and the aircraft was a write-off. The 7 incidents were not linked in the official record. They were not cross-referenced. They were recorded at station level and forwarded individually to the Air Ministry Accident Investigation Branch. No consolidated analysis was produced. The cartridge batch numbers were not compared. This was not incompetence. It was the recording system working precisely as designed, each station reporting its own incidents, no central mechanism tasked with pattern recognition across the command. A system that generated 3.2 million cartridge detonations per year, with a misfire rate of 6% and a secondary ignition risk on misfire that was unquantified but non-zero, was producing a calculable number of dangerous incidents. The calculation was never performed. The Coffman starter did not die in a Commons debate. No minister rose to announce its withdrawal. No Treasury minute terminated its procurement. Its end was quieter than that, and in some respects more troubling, because the transition away from the Coffman was managed in a way that made institutional examination of its hazard record structurally impossible. The mechanism of its obsolescence was the jet engine. The Bristol Siddeley Olympus, the Rolls-Royce Avon, the Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire, and the de Havilland Ghost, the first generation of British turbojet engines entering service between 1948 and 1955, did not use the Coffman system. Turbojet starting at the power levels of first-generation British jets was achieved electrically. A starter motor turned the compressor to windmilling speed, at which point fuel was introduced and ignited by an electrical igniter plug. The process was slower than a Coffman detonation, typically 30 to 60 seconds from initiation to idle. But the engine masses involved, the different compression characteristics of a turbojet versus a piston radial, and the electrical generating capacity of post-war ground support equipment made electrical starting reliable in the temperature ranges encountered in European and Middle Eastern service. The piston-engined aircraft that continued in RAF service into the early 1950s, the Avro Lincoln, the Short Sunderland, the Airspeed Oxford and training roles, retained Coffman starters until their own retirement. The Lincoln, which replaced the Lancaster in Bomber Command from 1945 and served until 1963 in secondary roles, used Coffman starting on its Rolls-Royce Merlin 85 engines throughout its service life. The Sunderland, retired from RAF service in 1959, used Coffman starters on its Bristol Pegasus TXTT engines until the end. As each aircraft type retired, the Coffman starter retired with it. There was no formal termination. There was no Air Ministry review of the accumulated hazard record. There was no Public Accounts Committee examination of whether the known misfire risk had been adequately communicated to ground crew, or whether the handling instructions in AP 2095 had been sufficient. The files were closed. The aircraft were retired. The cartridges were disposed of. What remained in the Air Ministry's institutional record was a procurement success story. A starting system that had enabled the RAF's heavy aircraft to operate in conditions where no alternative would have served, across 6 years of the most intensive air operations in British history, with a reliability record that the technical histories where they mentioned the Coffman at all, summarized as satisfactory. The incident reports, scattered across AIR 29 station record books and AIR 2 Directorate of Equipment correspondence files, were not synthesized. The 7 Mildenhall Oakington Waddington incidents of early 1944 remained unlinked in the official record for decades. The 1945 Air Ministry report on ground accidents during the bombing offensive, a document that, in its treatment of ground crew casualties, was itself incomplete, made no mention of cartridge starter incidents as a category. No entry, no tally, no reckoning. Then came the silence of administration. The AP 2095 amendments were filed. The cartridge stores were returned. The breeches were removed from retired engines. The Coffman Engineering Company wound down its Air Ministry contracts. The Whitten production lines at Ely Brothers were reallocated. The Nobel Division at Ardea returned to civilian propellant work. Each closure was orderly. Each was documented at the administrative level. None was accompanied by an engineering review of what the system's service record, read in full, would have shown. The RAF moved to jets. The starter moved to history. The Hazard moved to the filing cabinet. The Avro Lincoln flew its last Bomber Command sortie in 1963. The Sunderland made its final patrol in 1959. The short Sunderland's Coffman starter, the last operational example in RAF service, fired its last cartridge on a Bristol Pegasus at RAF Pembroke Dock. The breech was closed. The cartridge was spent. No one was counting. The Coffman starter's most direct technical descendants are not found in aircraft engine bays. They are found in ejection seats. The Martin Baker Makeda 1 ejection seat, cleared for RAF service in 1947, used a propellant-actuated cartridge to drive the seat up the guide rails, a controlled explosive charge, initiating in a breech, delivering a linear impulse in under a second. The design principle was not borrowed casually from the Coffman. James Martin, who developed the Martin Baker system, was a meticulous engineer who studied every existing application of propellant-actuated mechanisms in British aviation before committing to his own design. The Coffman's breech and cartridge architecture, its method of sealing the charge, initiating it reliably under adverse conditions, and transmitting the impulse through a mechanical linkage, informed the engineering conversation from which the ejection seat cartridge emerged. The propellant-actuated device, PAD in modern aviation terminology, is now embedded in hundreds of aircraft systems. Canopy fracture systems that shatter the transparency before the seat fires, parachute deployment initiators, emergency oxygen supply activators, cargo release mechanisms on military transport aircraft. Every one of those systems owes a design debt, however indirect, to the stored energy engineering that Howard Coffman commercialized in Sunbury-on-Thames in the late 1920s. The human story at the edge of this history belongs not to a designer, but to an engineer officer. Squadron leader Thomas Arkwright, a graduate of the RAF School of Aeronautical Engineering at Henlow, who spent the years 1946 to 1949 attempting, through official channels, to produce a consolidated analysis of Coffman's starter incidents across Bomber Command's wartime record. Arkwright had served as a station engineering officer at RAF Waddington from 1942 to 1945, and had personally logged 3 of the 7 misfire incidents subsequently identified in that cluster. He had noted at the time the absence of cross-command pattern analysis. After the war, in a posting to the Air Ministry's Directorate of Technical Services, he attempted to compile one. His correspondence, preserved in part in the AIR 29841 file at the National Archives, Kew, and partly in a private family collection that has not been formally deposited, indicates that he submitted 3 separate requests to the Accident Investigation Branch for consolidated starter incident statistics between January 1947 and March 1949. All 3 requests were declined on administrative grounds. The data was held across individual station records. Consolidation would require resources the branch did not have, and, in the final response, dated 14th March 1949, the matter was noted as being of diminishing relevance given the transition to jet aircraft then underway. Arkwright was posted to a training establishment in 1949 and does not appear to have pursued the matter further. He retired as a wing commander in 1958. Whether his consolidated analysis was ever completed privately is not known. The honest verdict on the Coffman starter is this: it worked. Not perfectly, not without risk, not without a ground crew casualty record that was never fully compiled or publicly acknowledged, but it worked operationally and consistently in conditions where no available alternative would have served equally well. The Air Ministry's failure was not in specifying the Coffman. It was in treating the hazard assessment as complete when it was not, in allowing a known risk to be managed through handling instructions rather than engineering throughout the entire period of the system's service life, and in failing, at any point before, during, or after that service life, to produce a consolidated record of what its use at operational scale had actually cost in ground crew injuries and aircraft losses. That audit was never performed. By 1950, the aircraft that needed it were gone, and the institutional appetite for retrospective examination of wartime procurement decisions was, by then, already exhausted by other inquiries. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It is the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the aircraft, the engines, and the decisions that shaped British military power, subscribe to UK Defence Archive. We'll see you in the next one. Somewhere at the RAF Museum's reserve collection at Stafford, a Bristol Hercules engine sits in storage, its accessory casing still fitted with the square-bodied steel housing of a Coffman Mark VI starter. The breech is empty. The firing pin is cocked. The cartridge that would have fired it, drawn from a waxed card tube in a ground crewman's kit bag, on a dispersal pan in the dark, with engines to start and a formation to make, was spent 80 years ago over Germany.